Well, thanks so much for spending your valuable time joining us here today, but it will definitely be worth it. Really excited to introduce you to our guest today, Michael Vasquez, and we're going to be talking about negotiating past the opioid crisis, which is a pretty huge and hot topic now, and sadly, a very ongoing issue. And Michael will maybe be able to give us some tips on how we can have that not be the case going forward. So, welcome, Michael. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Cindy.
And for those of you who don't know him, frankly, Michael's bio is too long and too darn impressive to be able to recite in full here. He's got a very interesting history. I encourage you to look that up. We'll make sure to put it in the show notes. But for the purposes of today's talk, he's the author of The Untold Story of the Opioid Crisis in American Healthcare. He founded St. Gregory's Retreat Centers for people suffering from substance abuse. He developed a proprietary cognitive behavioral therapy program for patients addicted to prescription painkillers. He helped develop an intravenous body chemistry solution to reduce opioid cravings. He developed a mass spectrometer lab to ID metabolites of opioids. He's founded Harborview Medical, providing orthopedic stem cell procedures as non-invasive alternatives to help avoid long-term opioid prescriptions, and more recently founded Opioid Clinical Management. So, and that's only a small piece of the things he's achieved in his career. So it's not a surprise that he's been named Entrepreneur of the Year. He was indicted into the Entrepreneur Hall of Fame, named an American Success Story by Entrepreneur Magazine. So get your pads and pens ready, because I'm sure there's going to be lots of really interesting tips here today. So Michael, why don't we start? Tell us, how did you come to this focus on opioids? You had such a long, quite established, successful history in other business areas. So I'd be interested in your story.
My career coming out of college, I was a comp sci major and was selected to be the CEO of a new company that was building an AI system for hospitals. We actually grew that to a point where we were able to take it public on NASDAQ and sell it to 3M Healthcare. So it was the first company that did that.
Wow.
And then right after that, built a large company here in the US that re-automated Medicare Part A. And we were managing when we sold that company, we were managing 39 billion of the Medicare program here in the US through our software. Sold that company when almost at the exact same time, my oldest son became involved with drugs, a story I'm sure a lot of your listeners have had experience with. And he and his friend passed away. And that was sort of a wake-up call for us that we thought, we've been blessed with time and resources.
Yeah.
So we thought, let's get involved and see if we can help somehow. But we found that the success rate in the US is not that good, especially with opioids. Only 18% of people in the US who need help with opioids ever get help.
Wow.
And only 30% ever recover. Opioids are a drug that you never really see old opioid users. You either quit or you die.
Wow.
And so we decided that we'd start with a white piece of paper and start to develop a program that could be based on the best evidence in the world, and started with that. And so fast forward 12 years, 10,000 patients. We built one of the largest treatment programs in the country. Even though we're in Des Moines, Iowa, which is, if you're aware, right in the middle of some of the coldest areas of the US, 80% of our patients came from Florida, Texas, and California because of the amazing results we were getting. And why were we getting those results? As we broke down, I realized as reading everything that it was a chemistry problem, not a character problem. And so many people addressed it as character. And once we broke down the brain chemistry of what opioids did to you, we could start to reverse engineer that and start to solve it. And that's really where this all started, was in that effort as we came out of that.
Wow, some pretty sobering numbers there. I thought I had a pretty good awareness of the issue, but that's shocking even to me. And if you don't mind me asking, how is your son doing now?
Very well, amazing. He's doing amazing. So he's it's been a blessing. So it's just really been amazing. He's 40 years old, has a 10-year-old grandson. So he's doing great.
Well, and what a blessing for him to have parents who are able to create the resources that he needed. Now, and just going back a little, like, how did this come to be such an epidemic? I mean, it is now recognized as a crisis. I mean, we're seeing Netflix and other specials all over. I mean, it's become a much more talked about issue, but how did we get here?
As you mentioned, I just recently wrote a book called The Untold Story of the Opioid Crisis in American Healthcare, and I dedicated an entire chapter to that. But the cliff notes to that are the fact that you saw pharmaceutical companies. There was an article done in the American Journal of Medicine that said that opioids were not addictive. It was six sentences. And it
Wow.
became the standard of care in the 70s and 80s. And what happened is pharmaceutical companies then latched onto that,
Yeah.
started a marketing campaign around that. And next thing you know, we woke up with an opioid crisis, but to later realize that that article was based on a small sampling of patients just in the hospital, never
Yeah.
talked about when they left.
Oh,
And so
gee.
that's really how the crisis started. And if
Yeah.
you're sure, I'm sure you're aware, 80% of all the opioids in the world are prescribed in the United States. So
Wow.
it's really focused here in the
Yeah.
States.
That's remarkable. That's a little frightening. So how can we, switching gears, like how do we recognize that someone in our life may be addicted to opioids? And I mean, you've obviously got some personal experience here. I've got a long line of addictions history in my family, so it's something I'm always interested in getting perspective on.
Yeah, you start to see early on, because that's the one thing that you have to understand. Opioid abusers are using opioids to feel normal. It's not a euphoric drug.
Yeah.
So it's not like your cocaine addiction, your meth
Yeah.
addictions, other cannabis to be more mellow. It's really used to feel normal. And what happens is they use it regularly to get that normalcy. By human nature, we're all driven to be happy and
Yeah.
satisfied. And the minute I'm not getting satisfaction in my life, it's a method to get to that happiness and satisfaction and feel normal. And
Yeah.
so the first indicators are that opioid users, the one blessing is they're not consistent. And the half-life of opioids is about 4 to 5 hours. And so if they aren't consistent in finding it, taking it, or abusing it, they start to present with what we call withdrawal symptoms. You've probably heard the term, but
Yeah.
withdrawal symptoms are really, some as an abuser, you call it that voice on your shoulder whispering in your ear. But from an actual chemistry aspect, it's the fact that your body is screaming out for that opioid because it wants to feel normal. And the way it does that is it's going to make you sick. I'm going to
Yeah.
make you nauseated until you give me an opioid. I'm going to
Wow.
not let you sleep until you give me an opioid. I'm going to make you anxious. So you're looking for those indicators of unusual activity in that loved one that isn't normal for them. So they seem more anxious than normal. They seem more, restless. They seem different illnesses that you just hadn't seen present before. And then they start to come out with unreasonable thoughts and take unreasonable actions. And those are the early indicators, I think, of what you start to
Yeah.
see.
Yeah. Well, and that's an interesting perspective. And I want to really put a pin in that for our listeners as well, because we always assume, oh, what are the indicators when they're on the drugs? And I think this applies for many drugs, frankly. Often the behavioral issues that you're going to start noticing
Yeah.
are when they're in the withdrawal, when they need it. So
Yeah.
I totally hear you on that. Now, what advice do you have for our listeners on, how to negotiate, which is a term a lot of people, for our listeners, you may not think of this as a negotiation, but it really is. How do we negotiate or navigate if we have an opioid abuser in the family? Like, what are some steps that we can take?
Well, there's two environments when you think about negotiating with an opioid user. One is in the household, and the second is how do you deal with them if you're trying to help them and treat them?
Yeah.
And so let's look at the household side of it. And what happens is you have to draw a line and really sit down with them, because what happens is, because as I mentioned earlier, they're not consistent with their drug usage, they do then at that point when they feel like they can't get that drug, they
Yeah.
scream out for help. That's the time they come to the kitchen table and say, listen, I've got this problem. I can't deal with it and I need help. And then what happens is an hour later, they maybe find a way to score and they seem normal. And
Uh,
so that they're the
yeah.
hardest person to negotiate in the world, because you're negotiating from a point of love.
Yeah.
They're negotiating from a point of survival.
Yeah.
To them, they feel like they're going to die. Opioid withdrawal, I've had thousands of people swear that they're going to die. You don't die from opioid withdrawal, though. You die from alcohol withdrawal
Yeah.
because you become dehydrated, you have a
Yeah.
seizure, and you'll die. You don't die from opioid withdrawal, but you'd swear you're going to. So at that point, what you have to do is recognize that and draw a line in the sand and let them know that you are not going to accept unreasonable actions or unreasonable thoughts anymore.
Yeah.
And that's got to be a hard line in the sand. I know I've been paying for your cell phone. I know
Yeah.
you've got a car. I know these other things that I've been supporting.
Yeah.
I can't support that, because
Yeah.
if this activity continues, and you always put in the table, then you need to get help.
Yeah.
And the problem is you have to be ready the minute they say yes, because they won't say, as I said earlier, they're acting normal. And when they're normal, they don't want help.
Yeah.
And so it's the minute they finally get short on that drug, that they scream out and say, I need help, that you have to be ready to move literally that hour. So you
Yeah.
have to have in the background set up a treatment program, someplace you're going to transport them to,
Yeah.
what you're going to do, because if you're not ready then, an hour later, that opportunity could be lost.
And I want to stop for one sec because that is such an important point, Michael. And we've had that personally, just to be transparent as well, not for opioids, but other issues in our family with addiction. And most people don't do that prep in advance. And I was guilty of that as well, where I did the negotiation piece. But you've pointed out you've got those two, the time when they're in need and then how quickly that changes. So you've got these two dramatically different personas and finally got them to a stage where they acknowledged help. But then by the time I got the resources in line, they were past that phase or at a different stage, and I had missed that window. So that is really, really great advice for our listeners there to be able to get those resources in place in advance so you're ready to just hit the button
Yep.
when the opportunity arises.
Absolutely. That's the only way, really. And you got to remember, you're negotiating for their survival, and you have to take
Yeah.
that mindset as
Yeah.
they are, but you're coming at it from a different angle. Now, once they enter a treatment program, it does change because they've already at some point admitted, and they know now at that point they've accepted that they need to try to get help. And
Yeah.
so what we do at that point is we really think of it cognitively, as I described, and a lot of people use the term cognitive behavior therapy.
Yeah.
What that is in layman's terms, I went to a rural high school, so I like to keep things
Yeah.
simple, is the fact that really cognitive behavioral health therapy is where your thoughts become your beliefs.
Yeah.
What you believe dictates your actions dictate your habits, and your habits really start to form your character and your
Yeah.
destiny. So what you have to do is you have to start at the beginning. I can't stop it. And so many treatment programs start in the middle. I'm going to tell you what to do. You can't
Yeah.
use drugs. And that really doesn't work. I have to change your thoughts. So what's an example of that? We have people who come through and we get them to just open up on what do they view the best version of themselves? How do they get there? And what's that look like? And they
Yeah.
have to commit to it. So this isn't an hour discussion. It's a week-long discussion where they're documenting it, journaling it, working towards that. And at that point, when the unreasonable thought comes up, I'm here for opioids, but it's okay if I smoke pot, probably. It's legal
Yeah.
in Colorado. I can do what I want.
Yeah.
But what you've described in your journal is that when you leave here, you want to be a fireman. You want to be a policeman. And so we know that we have their commitment of what their best version of themselves looks like. And do you think you can reach that? Can you pass a drug screen if you're trying to reach to be a fireman? No.
Yeah.
So you have to change your thinking that pot is okay because it doesn't fit into the version of what's the best version of yourself. And that's really how we attacked it and what cognitive
Yeah.
therapy means inside of a treatment program.
Such an important fact. And it's fun. It's one of those things I wish we taught that in elementary school. And frankly, I'm at a loss to know why we don't. It is a game changer in life that our reality is determined by our thoughts and the meaning we attach them. And we spend so little time getting intentional about that. I often say negotiating our mindset is one of our most important negotiations. And that's a great start. Now, what are some of the most sort of alarming truths about opioid addiction that maybe are some of our listeners need to know, whether just for their own edification or in order to negotiate with a loved one?
I think that the obvious one that everybody's going to be aware of is the advent of fentanyl. And so what happens is there's two different categories as I view the fentanyl crisis. One is the fact that if you're addicted to opioids, it's a progression. I'm not getting, and I won't get into the brain chemistry here because it's a longer discussion, but by the brilliance of the US pharmaceutical companies, they've exactly mimicked the morphine molecule. So the brain lets it attach to a receptor, but the brain's enzymes, which are typically washing away that molecule, don't work on that morphine molecule, the artificial molecule, which is
Yeah.
opioids. And so at that point, you become more tolerant and you need a higher and a higher dose to get the same feeling of normalcy. And fentanyl is viewed on the street as that ability to get closer to that normalcy because it's got a higher intensity. And so that's where the challenge becomes, is because people are using it thinking they're just
Yeah.
going to the next level, obviously naively that it's safe, and then it progresses from there. And typically you'll find other drugs involved at the same time that
Yeah.
deplete, slow down breathing. The other side of the coin is the illicit side, where people have replaced a pill that you think you're taking, an Adderall, and it's laced with fentanyl.
Yeah.
Those are the ones where we have to rely on the legal system to interdict and intervene to help us control that.
Yeah. Beautiful. Now, one of the issues that I think becomes really problematic for people with any kind of addiction, frankly, is that issue of codependency. So I think, one of the dangers of ongoing negotiations with a loved one suffering from an addiction is this issue of codependency. So what are some signs you would say that you've become either codependent or an enabler? And if so, when do you draw that? You talked about drawing that line in the sand,
Yeah.
right? When do you take the tough love approach?
Yeah, I think the minute you realize that a loved one's dealing with that, either through their admission or through your suspicion and
Yeah,
confrontation, and at that point, it has to be implemented because it won't get better. It doesn't heal itself. And at that point, if it isn't brought to a head, either through treatment or through intervention, it's not going to get better. So at that point, you draw, and when I say draw a line in the sand, you just make sure they understand you will no longer accept
yeah,
unreasonable thoughts or unreasonable actions. Unreasonable action is I'm not going to accept you using drugs in my house. I'm not going
yeah,
to allow you to continue to care for my grandchild if you're using drugs. And a hard line in the sand to be ready to make sure they know you're willing and
yeah,
able to take action on that. And that's that initial hardest belief for families, as we've talked to thousands of
yeah,
families of what do I do next?
yeah,
And the answer is always you've been enabling it. Well, I'm just paying for their cell phone. I'm
yeah.
just, letting them stay here because I want to make sure they're safe.
Safe.
And you don't realize, and so it's not the fact that you're consciously enabling.
Yeah,
The biggest problem is you're unintentionally enabling.
yeah.
And that's the piece you have to recognize and correct.
Yeah. And follow through. I mean, correct me if, because I
And
think that,
follow through. Yeah.
because then we've been there, right? Like we won't tolerate, it's all very well. And for our listeners, I invite you to think, if you're in this situation, if you keep saying we won't tolerate this in our house, but you keep allowing them to stay
Yeah.
in the house, then that is a form of
It's,
enabling.
you've normalized it then at that point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, we talked earlier about mindset. Do you have any advice for us about how to negotiate our mindset so we can, show up more powerfully, get better outcomes, whether for the people who are dealing with a loved one suffering from addictions or for the person themselves?
From a mindset aspect, it always comes from an aspect of, I think, love and compassion.
Yeah.
And it's the idea that as long as you can validate what you're doing is to try to save your life. If you think about it, we're put on earth to be saints.
Yeah.
And what's the definition of a saint? My job is to help get you to heaven in whatever effort I can do that in. And that's really the challenge. And so you have to take that mindset with them and say, my goal is I recognize there's a challenge in your life and I need to help the best I can, maybe to the limit. My resources, my knowledge may be limited, but I have to find those resources to get you where you're safe or you can thrive. And so I think the mindset more is, and then being able to make the hard decisions of part of that mindset is knowing when to say there's a line in the sand
Yeah.
and I've committed, I'm not going to cross that, because if you do, I'm supporting you on a path to losing your life, because
Yeah.
it will happen.
Yeah. I love that. That's beautiful. And so important. And again, and tied to that, I think, is just to put a pin in it for our listeners, what you were saying earlier as well, is that recognition that our thoughts become our reality, right? And I think that goes for both sides, both for the person who has the addiction to be able to see that highest version of themselves, but also for family members or people who are dealing with loved ones who are suffering from opioid addictions or any addiction, frankly. Get really intentional about what your thought process is before you sit down to have those negotiations, before every interaction. So you decide, who do I want to be? What's the highest version of myself that I can bring to the table for this particular discussion, right? I think that's really great advice, Michael. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and the good thing is use the internet. I mean, one thing, my first exposure, I've never had a problem, never dealt with it. So I've been blessed that way. But my exposure has been interesting because I came home when I was 14 and found my mother laying on the floor unconscious with a needle in her arm.
Oh,
And it's a long story, and I talk about it in my book about how that came
yeah.
about. But that vision is the one thing that drives you, is you don't want, and I've been driven, is I don't want other people to have to deal with that. You just don't need that. There's too much in life to live for.
Oh, that's wow. Thank you for sharing that. My gosh, I can't wait to read the book. I confess I hadn't had a chance. I was so excited to get you on the show here. I haven't had a chance to read the book
No,
yet.
that's fine.
And tied to that, the other thing is fear, I think, right? Sometimes when we're trying to help, when we show up from a fear-based place ourselves, we don't show up as the best version of ourselves in those negotiations or discussion. Then we do a disservice to ourselves and the person we're trying to help. Now, switching gears for a moment, any advice you have for how we can start to negotiate with doctors or with the healthcare system to change how this is
It's
approached?
interesting, the one discovery we had that our software is based around is the discovery that inside of every medical record are the indicators that a patient is progressing towards opioid addiction.
Hmm.
And through the use of the application of AI, we've been able to uncover those indicators where until today in the US, you can't find them. You
Yeah.
can't find them until the patient progresses to actually acting out. They're doctor shopping, they're trying to
Yeah.
get a prescription refilled early, they're going to multiple pharmacies. So it's pathological at that point. It's their
Yeah.
behaviors or their actions. The benefit with the advent of AI is I can find now a patient who's progressing towards addiction 5 months before any other technology in the
Wow.
US because I can find the medical indicators that I've described already hidden inside of the medical record. So
Yeah.
you could, as a user, you could hide how you're getting the opioid, how you're taking it. I may never know, but the
Yeah.
thing you can't find are the illnesses that go along with it. And
Hmm.
the illnesses are not how it's making you sick. It's the withdrawal symptoms that are making you ill. And so because you're not consistent, it's the one drug that different than congestive heart failure, diabetes, where you're very consistent with your prescription.
Yeah.
With a painkiller, most Americans are not consistent with their painkiller
Yeah.
because of the severity fluctuation of pain. It's unique because of the fact that my hip feels better today. So I think I'm going to skip my script and then I'm
Yeah.
busy at lunch and I skip it again. And by tonight, I've unknowingly, unintentionally thrown myself into withdrawal. Mild and may never recognize it, but it's the beginning of that exposure. And then in some patients, it progresses because if their genetics, if their entire mindset, I really feel like your ability to recover is based on your ability to sleep, your activity, and your nutrition. And when you
Yeah.
marry those three together, it sort of builds a map of how susceptible you are
Yeah.
to that. And so from that, then we built an ability to, in the US, HIPAA, which guides the disclosure of health information, really
Yeah.
limits us to what we can do. So we actually came at it from the other way. If you remember, I said earlier, 75% of all patients who enter opioid treatment do it because their doctor wrote the prescription. So we thought, what if we start at the other end of the spectrum and find the doctors that are letting this happen,
Yeah.
not the patients it's happening to?
Yeah.
Because then I could prevent it as opposed to try and treat it. And
Wow.
the thing that I've enjoyed the most over the last few years is treatment is never 100% successful. I mean, and people have to completely destroy their lives to get to a point where they get to
Yeah.
treatment.
Yeah.
They've destroyed their family relationships, their finances, their careers, and then they get treatment. Where if I could prevent that, then they never go through that. And so what we found is by early indicators with the AI giving us a heads up of who the doctors are that are practicing not to best practice, and best practice is defined by how you should prescribe opioids. Get that doctor identified and then get them to change, not recognize or change how they practice medicine, but how they prescribe opioids. And at that point, we've been 95% successful. 1,700 employers now in the US who are using our software daily to help protect their employees from progressing to addiction. And the way we've done that is by getting the physicians to recognize that they need to change a bit to help prevent it. And we took the exact same mindset we took inside of the treatment program and did it cognitively.
Yeah. What a great initiative. My God. So I assume that's what you mean, because I've heard you say that AI may help prevent the opioid crisis. So is this that system that you're talking
That's
about? That's beautiful.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
do you suggest that people reach out to the doctor? I mean, I know the doctor's precluded from sharing information without the patient's consent, but what are your thoughts on if you've got a concern about a loved one, reaching out to their doctor to give a heads up that you're suspicious at least? Because I think some of them are so mass producing, they're not even,
Yeah,
uh,
the physicians, because of HIPAA, and if you're not on the release,
yeah,
chances are an addicted person will not put you on the release.
yeah,
Then it's going to be fruitless because they shouldn't and they probably won't disclose the information. Your best action is what we've already described, is to recognize it yourself and that your doctor is not going to be the solution. Because at that point, if your loved one's already addicted and presenting with
yeah.
addicted issues, they're going to need treatment. And the
Okay.
key thing I'll throw out, if there's any takeaway from today, is make sure that you get a medical detox. With other drug addictions, you don't have to go, other than alcohol and opioids, you don't have to go through detox.
Yeah.
When you stop, your body can start to wean itself off. Opioids, the success rate is terrible if you don't go through medical detox. So the one
Okay.
thing I'd suggest is seek out and find a medically managed detox center
Yeah.
if a loved one's dealing with opioids.
Okay, great advice. Now, you had mentioned your book, and I had as well, The Untold Story of the Opioid Crisis in American Healthcare. What was one of the most surprising or shocking things that you discovered while you were writing or researching your book?
I think the discovery actually came as building the company is that discovery that we found indicate not only that we found indicators inside of the medical record. I think the eye opener for me was nobody else in the US was doing it.
Yeah.
When I found it, I thought, well, this is not, it's one of those things you look at and you set to the side because I think, well, everybody must do this. And then the more
Yeah.
I asked questions, and then I moved up the chain of credibility all the way to SAMHSA and the US CDC and presented this, nobody's doing it.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I realized we literally had discovered it without the intent. We weren't,
Yeah.
researching to discover this. And we said, maybe we've uncovered something here that can help. So that was the biggest enlightening thing for me is the discovery that nobody else had found this.
Yeah, yeah. Although you take for granted your skill set. I mean, looking at your history, I think you were quite uniquely positioned to be able to not only uncover this, but to actually follow through and see it become a reality. Now, do you have any non-negotiables that you would say when you're dealing with somebody who has an addiction? Either, well, and let's do both sides. Do you have any non-negotiables you would say for somebody who is personally dealing with an opioid addiction and or non-negotiables for people who are dealing with a loved one who have an addiction?
Yeah, I think some of the same suggestions I've made earlier is the fact that once you recognize those unreasonable thoughts and unreasonable actions, they have to realize that if they cross the line, we're going to treatment. And if we don't go to treatment, I'm going to have you committed because I don't know what it's like in Canada, but in the US,
Yeah.
I can have you committed.
Yeah.
And there's a vision that I still have burned in my mind that our son, he crossed
Yeah.
the line, we drew it, and the sheriff came to our house and got him.
Yeah.
And there's
Yeah, it's
nothing
hard,
worse than
and
seeing
that's
him
hard to
leave.
do, but, we've been there.
And I do have to give credit to there's usually a team that's dedicated to these commitments, and they're very compassionate. They realize what's going on, and they did a wonderful job of doing what they did, but they got him into treatment. He's then committed for 3 days.
Yeah,
He then has to have that brief intervention of realizing, okay, we met what we said, and what do I do? And then
yeah,
at that point, you have to be ready with that plan. And so that's the extreme. Hopefully everybody doesn't have to deal with that, but we had to do that. We didn't have a choice. He didn't give
yeah,
us a choice.
yeah,
So that's really the biggest non-negotiable you've got to be is to commit to it and know what your options are because some communities are different on what's it take to get somebody committed,
yeah,
what's the process, how long can it be, and then have a plan for after the commitment. They can't, this is my biggest problem, and I don't want to get off the topic, but my biggest problem with Narcan is that patients will use Narcan, which will save their life because they overdose from
yeah.
opioids. But what you do is you get put into a 4-hour stabilization observation in a hospital, and then they discharge you to the street
Wow,
and
that's
they
crazy.
give you a referral to treatment.
Yeah,
And that's it.
that is
And and the reason I brought that up is the fact that I went to a conference and sat next to a coroner, and he said he's looking for temporary help because what he's finding is patients were found in their pathology that they had been given Narcan, and
yeah,
then they went home. They thought, well, I'm just like think about a diet. I'm going to have one
yeah,
more last hurrah,
absolutely.
and they actually passed away from that. And so when he did the pathology, he found a layer of Narcan or of opioids, synthetic opioids, and then opioids on top of that that really took him past that. So I'm a little frustrated with the health system not having
Yeah,
a more of a commitment to making sure it's a lost opportunity to help that person. And I know they have some legal
yeah.
guidelines and boundaries that they probably can't push much past that. But if there was something I could fix or had a magic wand, that would be one of them.
And that is an easy fix, frankly. I didn't realize that. I mean, if somebody has suicidal ideation, there's a mandatory sort of referral. As you say, family can have somebody on and they become mandatory referrals. If somebody is actually overdosed, to me, that's a bit of a no-brainer that there's further intervention that is required. Just sending them back out on the street again after they've
Yeah.
that's shocking to me. And when you talked about it, and thank you again for sharing your personal experience with your son about that, because I think for many people that's a hurdle that they can't get over. So talk for a second, if you will, about what role emotion plays in these negotiations, if I could call it that.
Yeah, it's my wife was just, I mean, it was harder on, I think, the spouse.
Yeah,
I'm a little more black and white in my decision making. And so at
yeah,
that point, and the reason is you become resentful. At that point, keep in mind, this just didn't happen overnight. I
Yeah.
just didn't decide tomorrow
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
have him committed. It had been a process over the
Yeah.
last year before that he just worn me down.
Yeah.
And I really didn't have any sympathy from an aspect that he needed to get help. And he was putting his brothers through hell, his,
Yeah.
my wife. And so what he was doing for there, I really had to get over the resentment as much as anything else.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for sharing that because it is a heartbreaking process, right? I mean, it is grueling and it's lengthy and an emotional roller coaster that impacts on everybody. And I think there's so much stigma around mental health and addictions that we don't talk about it enough. So and again, I'm appreciative of you coming on and sharing this. And for our listeners out there, I hope you're open to sharing this conversation because it's an important conversation to start having. And those people who've been engaged, very few people are open like this. So again, Michael, I really appreciate you sharing that personal experience as well, because that's the piece that gets missed in the equation. And then when people are faced with it, they're not equipped emotionally to deal with
Right.
this because they weren't prepared to set those hard guidelines and recognize how challenging it is when you have to take those next steps. It's not easy, but it's worth it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So
It does, it can help. It can't, there is light at the other end, but you have to hold to it. And even if, so let's say it doesn't work out the way you desire, meaning obviously I've dealt with so many families who held the line and the child still passed
yeah,
away. As long as you could reconcile that you did the right thing,
yeah,
and there wasn't, at that point, that was in God's hands. There was nothing else you could do because
yeah,
you did the right thing. And that's
yeah,
all you can do because you don't want to look back and say, I wish I would have,
yeah,
because that's what my concern was. I didn't want to look back and say, I wish I would have. If we would have had him committed, if we would have this.
yeah.
And I just decided that I'm going to do whatever it takes. Because I don't want to look back and say, I wish I would have.
Yeah. Well, and do you discuss this in your book? I assume you have some of these tips like the practical, or is it just talk about the evolution of the process, or do you also talk about how to deal with it?
I talk a little bit about my history in the first three chapters. The balance
Yeah.
is a bit of the middle part is about the chemistry. And then the balance of it is talking about building the company.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I'm really interested in reading about the chemistry because again, you don't hear much conversation about, and given the extent of the crisis, it's stunning to me that we hear so little about that
yeah.
aspect of it. So,
Well,
well,
it
Michael,
is a unique view that not many people have taken, but we've proven it through experience. And so
yeah.
I talk about in the book on how it works, but it's amazing.
Yeah, no, can't wait. Can't wait to dig into that and to share the message, frankly. You have given us loads of information in a really short time, so I am extra appreciative of that as well. Definitely got a good bang for our buck here. And for our listeners, I hope you appreciate that you tuned in and all of the information. You may want to listen to this a couple of times to make sure that you've caught everything. And I normally like to end, Michael, by asking what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've ever had in your life? And it doesn't have to be on this issue, anything, one of those aha shifts that changes how you show up or how you think about things.
I think as I've gotten older, it's more the idea that maybe I don't think the way everybody else does. And what I
I
think
love
might be
that.
unique, maybe is unique.
Yeah.
But the thing is that's not unique to me. We all
Yeah.
have that. We all have our specialty, our unique thing that we're brought here for. You just
Yeah.
have to find it. I tell when I talk to groups is the fact that you just have to keep cutting the pie down until you're the expert in that
Yeah.
pie. And
Yeah.
so you may be a person of one or a population of one, but you're the expert in that
Yeah.
population. And
Yeah.
I found that that's where I've got, and then become, I don't know a whole lot about a lot of things, but in the areas I know stuff about,
Yeah.
I'm the expert in those.
Yeah. I love that. I love that mindset shift on so many levels, actually. Because even as you were saying it at the beginning, I was thinking, how many times have we all had that idea about, oh, it would be great if there was this out there, but we naturally assume, oh, who am I to think it must already? And it turns out it wasn't. And then somebody else ends up doing it a few years later. And you're like, I thought of that years ago.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
trust in yourself. I think that's great advice. So tell us where people can learn more about you, Michael, about you and what you do.
I think you can go to obviously the book is on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. I think Amazon's out of stock right now, but Barnes and Noble, and my author website is Michael, Michael dash Vasquez, VASQUEZ.com. And then that'll get you to other links. And so I think
Beautiful.
that's a good start.
That's awesome. And we'll make sure to put that in the show notes as well for our listeners. So don't panic if you miss that. We'll make sure to have that available for you. And I do encourage you, if this is a subject that you're interested in, and frankly, we all should be, and especially if you're dealing with someone that you care about, or if you're struggling yourself, make sure to get that resources, make sure to check out the website and reach out as well to get some value. And I am sure you all got loads of value from this episode. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done that yet. And as always, give the gift of sharing. Make sure to share this episode with people that you know who can get some benefit from this message. And before we sign off today, just wanted to share some ways that we can work together. If you're looking to up-level your negotiation skills, I've got everything from online to group to my signature VIP and mastermind experiences to help you better leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. If that sounds interesting, check out our website at theartoffemininenegotiation.com. And make sure to grab a copy of my book at The Art of Feminine Negotiation if you haven't done that already. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.